All right. Well, hello, everyone, and good morning, and good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you're joining us from. My name is Dalia, and I work as a Senior Developer Marketing Manager here at Kong. I'm very happy to have you here at our workshop, the second part for this quarter, Workshop Automations 2.1. We're going to be talking about API Ops in action today. We have Jordi with us. He will introduce himself and tell you a little bit more about what he's doing here at Kong and about the previous workshop that we did and what we have coming up as well. I will also put the links in the chat so you can follow along. Just making sure that you know this is being recorded and you will receive an email afterwards with the recording plus some additional resources for you to review. We also have the Developer Day, which Jordi will tell you a little bit more about and what information will be presented there at the end of October, which will be a wrap up for the series of automations. Please put all of your questions from today in the Q&A function, which you will see on the bottom, so then we can keep track of what we're answering. And then if you have any technical difficulties or anything, please put your comments in the chat. And with that, Jordi, please take it away from here.
Thank you, Dalia. And thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Jordi Fernandez, and I'm here a principal architect at Kong in the professional services team. Which means that what I do is that I work with our customers, that's enterprise customers across the EMEA region, and I work with them on defining their architecture, helping them shaping their API strategies, and how to best use our products like Kong Konnect, in this case, our platform, to deploy an API platform that serves as the basis to their API strategies and to their overall IT strategies. I've been with the company for more than 3 years now. Very excited to be here, and thank you again, everyone, for joining us in this second installment of this Konnect Automations series of workshops. This is the second one after the 101 that was led by my colleague Panos at the end of August. Now we are here with this second part, the end of September, and there will be a third part to close the loop at the end of October, in which we will then showcase the full pipeline of an API Ops, what we consider here at Kong in professional services, an API Ops that encodes the best practices that we can see according to our experience. And after working with hundreds of customers, Kong has been working with those enterprise customers for the last 8 years. So there is I hope, a lot of knowledge and techniques that you will take away from this workshop. Now, let me tell you a little bit. And by the way, Dalia just shared with you in the chat the link to the upcoming third item in this series, which is the webinar on October the 28th. Now, let me go over a little bit of what are we going to see during this workshop. So first of all, we will continue with where we left the first one. Here we are working with an airline, which we call Kong Air, which of course is not a real airline, but this is a company that we use, an imaginary company that we use to illustrate our examples. So Kong Air is going through an API transformation. They are adopting an API strategy in the organization. And of course, part of that strategy is to create the services that the API teams are going to need to deploy fast and deliver new experiences to their consumers. So we're going to take a look at the journey so far. And then in this specific workshop, we will focus on how to automate Kong Gateway configuration, while at the same time encoding in there the governance rules and some other elements that we need to encode in a pipeline like that. We will see a live demo. We will see an example pipeline that does exactly that and what are the steps involved. And we will have some time at the end for Q&A as well. So let's start. Remember, this is the second part. The first part is already recorded. That's something that if you go to our website, you can see that if you haven't yet, or even in our YouTube channel, you can find the recording in there, or you can follow the links that Dalia is sharing with you in the chat. All right, so what about Kong Air? What is happening at the company? Well, Kong Air is going through an API transformation. They decided, or they see clearly that it's a key strategy nowadays for any enterprise company to adopt a way of working in which core capabilities of the organization are productized via APIs. And when we are talking about airlines, this is a common set of key capabilities that any airline has to master: flight operations, ground operations, maintenance, repair and overhaul, commercial operations, customer service. Those are core capabilities to any airline to be able to serve their partners, their providers, and their passengers, their customers. And it is no surprise that in the last couple of years, there has been an explosion of user interfaces and different experiences that customers and partners are using to interact with any airline, be it via the web, via mobile apps, be it in chat applications. Of course, nowadays, with this whole wave of AI agents, social interactions in social media. So customers are using whichever experience and front end is more comfortable for the specific task at hand. And so a company that wants to excel at customer experience has to be very good at orchestrating the user journey across all those channels. And that implies that they have to be consuming the same capabilities from the same sources to have a consistent and coherent way of sharing the data and sharing the status of that journey for each one of those customers. And so it's very clear for management that an API transformation has to happen. We need to manage APIs as products. We need to productize our capabilities via APIs. And in order for those API teams to be fast and to be effective at delivering new use cases and new capabilities, they need a supporting function, which is what we call the API platform engineering function, that will provide some of the more infrastructure core API processing capabilities as a service to those API teams to create an excellent developer experience, which is the purpose of any APIOps strategy or activities that you may want to execute in your organization. We do APIOps to create, among other things, great developer experiences, which means developers will have the time to focus on the experiences that they have to deliver, will be able to consume those services in a self-service manner to maximize their autonomy and not to have to go through different steps of approval or heavy processes to deliver new features. Now, this all sounds very good and well on a couple of slides, but the reality is that when any company wants to scale these type of techniques and capabilities to a certain extent, this is when things start to become a little bit complicated. It's not the same to provide services for 2, 3, or 5 teams than to provide services for 50 or 500 teams, like we've seen in some of our customers, big enterprise customers in the region. And that requires a certain level of coordination, requires a certain level of governance, requires as well a certain level of commonality in terms of the technologies that are used. Those are necessary ingredients to then offer self-service such as onboarding to the platform, which was, by the way, the topic of the first workshop. My colleague Panos did a great job there on showing how this could be set up in a way that is really fast and very easy to consume by the teams that are developing the APIs. There are capacity constraints that we need to solve, and that's one of the best reasons to use APIOps, so that to work one time for the platform team and to be able to then productize this as a service for the rest of the API teams. We want to avoid repetitive work, and we want to avoid team dependencies and coordination meetings and alignment meetings and waiting for approvals. We want API teams to be self-sufficient, fast, and work with a great deal of autonomy. Now, for that to be a reality, we need to have a strategy, and Kong Air has developed a vision for its transformation into a great API company. That implies having a self-service onboarding, which again, we saw already in the first installment of this series. We need infrastructure autonomy so that API teams can request infrastructure resources with full autonomy without having any handoffs or stopgaps in the middle. We need as well a platform team that can focus and shifts from manual operations to full and complete automation that has its own guardrails and its own governance processes in place, so that then we can share that with the rest of the API teams, which will mean, if we are successful, that we have a scalable way of operating our platform. And we should be able to then support 50 or 500 teams with the peace of mind that whatever is happening in our platform is happening in an aligned and in a governed way. And everybody is respecting those guardrails when deploying new APIs into our environment. So in this workshop, we are going to focus on the next step. We saw teams onboarding in the first workshop. Now it's time to present a strategy on how to provide a service to those API teams so that the API gateway, gets fully configured, fully automatically, without any intervention, and with minimal input by the API teams, which means with a great developer experience, right? So they just have to provide an open API specification and maybe a little bit more, and that's all they need to get going. The service provided by the platform team will take care of everything else. How are we going to do that? Or how do we advise our customers to go about this? How to develop this strategy? Well, almost any company has what we call the API community of practice or the API guild. And this is a place in which the platform team, or probably even the security team, enterprise architecture, and the API teams, they come together and they use that platform, use that place or that team or those meetings to agree on an API governance framework. So that happens in our imaginary airline at Kong Air. And they decided that the platform team will do much of the heavy lifting. That means that the platform team is responsible to provide a service to quickly onboard and without any friction API teams. So if an API team needs to make use of the Kong Konnect platform, they just go to a simple form, select a couple of fields, submit, and that creates a pull request in GitHub and a review by the platform team, and then everything gets provisioned for them automatically. This is something that we saw in the first workshop. Now, the platform team should be as well, or it has been agreed that the platform team will take care of providing a developer portal so that teams can publish their documentations and their open API specifications. The API team will as well provide a pipeline as a service so that every API that gets deployed will follow or will make sure that that API follows the Kong API guidelines, the Kong Air API guidelines, and even some OWASP security best practices. The platform team will take care of observability, authentication, rate limiting, and those cross-cutting concerns, which are more infrastructure related, if we want to call it this way. And then the platform team will take care of anything that is a global plugin or other global configurations that affects everybody in the platform, because those are considered more sensitive. And so the platform team will take care of that. And then what is under the responsibility of the API teams? Well, the API teams, they wish to work at the OpenAPI specification level. So Kong Air API teams, they want to focus on developing their APIs, implementing the core features that the company needs, and then stop at the OpenAPI specification level. Eventually, if they want to use some of the Kong plugins that Kong offers, which are more developer friendly, they are free to do so. There are some plugins in that category, which has been agreed. And then they should be able to request resources in the Konnect platform with autonomy. For example, we saw in the first workshop last month how the API teams were able to request control planes in Konnect for different environments. And that was a fully autonomy exercise using a pipeline that the platform team provided to them, right? So they didn't have to know the details of what was going on behind the scenes. That's the purpose of providing the service. They just consume the service, they specify what resources they want, and everything happens behind the scenes in a governed way, which means that every API team, they have their own credentials and they are allowed to modify only the assets that belong to them. They are not able to interfere with the assets of another API team, effectively creating like a multi-tenant environment or what we call a federated environment within Conger. How are we going to do this from the technology standpoint? So we will continue with the same technology stack that we used in the first workshop to keep the consistency across those three workshops that we will be delivering for you, which is we will use GitHub as our actions provider or APIOps pipeline provider. We will use the Kong Konnect, the Terraform provider that Kong provides for Kong Konnect. With this Terraform provider, you can completely specify declaratively what resources do you want to create or manage from Kong Konnect, and the whole platform is manageable as with the paradigm of infrastructure as code with the Terraform provider. We will use some AWS service, in this case an S3 bucket, to keep the state for the Terraform provider, and then a vault to store the credentials and the secrets. So we will leverage that. That was presented in the previous workshop as well. So that's essentially the technical, say the tech stack that we are going to use to continue what was started in the previous workshop. And to go a little bit more into the detail of what we will see during the demo, this is what we want to share with you, what we are going to implement. So as you can see on the left-hand side, in order to deploy in a fully automated way the Kong Gateway configuration in Kong Konnect, the only thing that we are going to request or to need from the API team is their OpenAPI specification, and eventually they can declare as well what plugins they wish to use that are provided by Kong, right? And that's all they have to provide. They don't need to care about anything else. Now they will call another GitHub action that has been prepared by the platform team, which they don't need to know the details. They just call that action. And that action will take care of validating that the OpenAPI specification is in alignment with the Kong Air API guidelines, so that the OAS specification that the API team provides validates against the guidelines and against the OWASP best practices. Then the pipeline will take care of transforming or translating that OpenAPI specification into Kong configuration, and Kong provides a tool for that, which is called Deck. And that tool will take care of a command line tool that will take care of transforming the OpenAPI specification into Kong configuration. Then we will iteratively and incrementally expand the functionality of that configuration by adding the plugins requested by the API team, the plugins that the platform team will add as well to that configuration based on the decisions that were made in the API community of practice. Then we will link this Kong configuration file to make sure that the API teams are using what they are allowed to use and not anything else. So Deck provides a linting feature as well. So you can provide a configuration file specifying what needs to happen there. And then Deck will take care of validating and linting the Kong configuration to make sure that it is conformant with the governance rules established at Kong Air. And then in the final stage, we will then obtain a diff. So we will know what is new, what is going to change in the configuration. We will back up the current configuration and then deploy the new configuration to the control plane. The control plane will then push that configuration to the data planes that are associated with it. Last step, the API will then be, Kong Gateway will be configured, which means that the API is going to be reachable, and then we can invoke the API through the Kong Gateway, and the API team will see that their implementation is then going through Kong with all the guardrails and all the governance rules applied to it, right? In a very easy way. you will see it's a great developer experience how all this is happening with minimal intervention of the API team. All right, so this is what we're gonna see. So let's go now to a demo of how this can be implemented. All right, let's start by taking a look at the source code. This is the repository of the API team. And as you can see, it's very simple. So there is a workflows directory and there is an APIs directory in which the team stores the OpenAPI specification that they are working with, which is this one, right? So it's a very simple flights service. It's an API that you can use to obtain the Kong Air planned flights, or you can obtain the details of a specific flight or by the flight number. And there are even additional details that you can fetch from a flight, from a specific flight. So there is an additional endpoint. As you can see, it's a very simple API, which is specified in this OpenAPI specification here. So that's the asset that's essentially the only asset that the API team has to provide for all this, what we mentioned previously, for all this to happen. So let me push this a little bit. And then if they want to use some Kong plugins, they can do so. So as you can see here under this directory, this team wants to use the correlation ID plugin. So there is a certain syntax that we have to follow when we use deck. And essentially what we are saying here is that for every route configured in Kong Gateway, we want to apply the correlation ID plugin with this configuration, which is essentially every request Kong will take care of adding a new header with this name, flights request ID, that will carry a unique identifier. So that's what the API team wants to use. And those two assets are the only thing that they need to provide. That's all, really. Next step is just they have a workflow. And by invoking this workflow, they simply have to use, as you can see here in this line, they simply have to use a GitHub action that has been provided by the platform team. So as you can see, we are pointing to an action that is provided in another repository in GitHub, the repository owned by the platform team. And this is one of the examples of how you can provide an API service or an APIOps pipeline as a service. You simply implement that as an action, and then you allow the API teams to invoke that action, which is in GitHub terms, a composite action, specifying what is the OpenAPI spec, what's the control plane in which you want to deploy these, what is the path in which I can find the plugins, which is this directory. What is the system account token? The system account token is the Kong Konnect token or credentials that belong to this specific team. And therefore, they will be allowed to do in Konnect a limited set of actions based on the credentials, which this was created during the first workshop. So you can revisit that if you wish. Credentials are stored in HashiCorp Vault, and there is a key vault in HashiCorp for this specific team. Right? So this is where the credentials are stored. This is the information that the service provided by the platform team needs. Give me your API specification. What plugin do you want to deploy to? The directory for any plugins that you want to use, and then your system account token and the Konnect server URL that you want to target. That's all that is asked for an API team. So as you can see, it's a very simple developer experience. Now let's go and see what is going on in this action provided by the platform team. Well, we can go in here, and if we go to GitHub Actions, which is actually, I have it open here. Let's take a look at what is going on in this action, right? Because there are quite some things going on in order to implement the governance rules that we saw before that were agreed in the API community of practice, right? Which is to say governance as code, if we want to call it this way. What is going on in this action? Well, it's taking, of course, the parameters that the API team is provided that we saw before. So all this information is coming in this action. And then we run it. First of all, we install Deck, which is the tool that I was mentioning before, provided by Kong, that will offer lots of features that are designed to be consumed in APIOps pipelines. We install the extra rule sets from Spectral regarding the OWASP best practices. Then we set the date. That's something that we are going to use later to back up current configuration. There are a couple of variables that we will need to set up for Deck, that Deck will use to create the configuration afterwards. But let's focus on the interesting bits here. And the first one is that this is how the pipeline will enforce that the API guidelines are being followed in the OpenAPI specification, right? So we're going to use, in this case, the Spectral CLI, and we are going to lean the rules based on additional rules that we have created in the .spectral.yaml file, right? Which is a file that is owned by the platform team. So the API teams, they don't need to worry about this. They don't need to work with this. The platform team provides, as we can see here in this Spectral file, some of the rules that were agreed in the API community of practice. So, for instance, we expect every API, every OpenAPI specification to have an operation ID. We need a team name and a format. We need in a certain format, so we are validating that. We are validating that the X business unit is informing the OpenAPI specification, and so on and so forth. And so there are a couple of rules here. And this is how we are enforcing additional. Of course, this is pretty simple. You can think that the Kong Air API guidelines could be encoded in this Spectral file, and so we will validate that the OpenAPI specification is in alignment with those guidelines. As a next step, we then convert the OpenAPI specification into Kong gateway configuration, and this is something that we do with Deck, with the command Deck file OpenAPI to Kong. This will translate the OpenAPI specification into Kong configuration, and then we start customizing this configuration based on, first of all, based on the plugins that the API team wants to use, which we saw was the correlation ID. So this step will incorporate the plugins, and after incorporating the plugins, then we have to check that those plugins are aligned with the guidelines and the governance rules. So we are going to make sure, again, with Deck file lint, we're going to make sure that the plugins that the API team wants to use belong to the set of plugins that are allowed to be used. And for that, the platform team has created a Kong ruleset.yaml file, which we can check here. And this is very similar to the spectral linting. So here we define what do we want to happen in that Kong configuration. So for instance, we do not allow API teams to declare global entities. That's reserved for the platform team. And we allow some plugins to be defined at the service level, and we allow some plugins to be defined at the route level. And so we let API teams to work with the request transformer or the request transformer advanced or response transformer or the correlation ID. This is one of the allowed, so should be fine that the API team is and that wants to use the correlation ID plugin. That's okay. And then there are a couple of plugins that the API community of practice agreed that the API teams should be able to use with full autonomy. So we are making sure that this is happening by linting the Kong configuration file in this step. And now if the API teams are in alignment with the governance rules, then we add the additional Kong configuration, but now owned by the platform team. And as you can see, the platform team is then adding plugins around authentication with OpenID Connect, around OpenAPI's validation with the OWASP validation plugin, and around rate limiting, right? So OWASP validation plugin is as well working in the sense of making sure that the OpenAPI specifications and the requests that will be received by Kong Gateway are in alignment with the Kong Air API guidelines. And so those plugins, which are an exclusive attribute of the platform team, will then be added at this step. And finally, we then proceed to the final steps of deployment. So we will add a couple of tags to add some metadata to the configuration to make it easier afterwards to identify some of the entities, routes, services, or plugins. We output the final configuration that we achieved, and we validate that the syntax is correct and everything is fine. There is another command for that. And finally, we synchronize. First of all, we obtain a backup. Then we obtain a diff to know what is going to change. We synchronize the configuration. That means that we send the configuration to the control plane that was requested by the API team, and then obtain another backup with the final configuration and the archival of the artifacts that we have been working on this pipeline. So it's not a complex pipeline. There's a lot of work in here in terms of we are validating governance around API guidelines, around security, around what plugins, how the Kong platform should be used by the API teams. And this is all, as you can see, that is completely transparent to the API team. The API team, they don't know what is going on here behind the scenes. They just trust that the platform team is providing all these services to them so that they can consume them, right? So here we can see, for example, examples of the plugins that are an exclusive competence of the platform team. And these are some of the plugins that will be included, right? So for instance, OAuth validation will be included in all services. That is what the platform team is implementing in here. So with all this pipeline in place, we can now maybe go and execute it. Let me check if I'm missing anything. No, I think we should be fine. So now it's time to go to, first of all, let me quickly show you, right, that we are using this vault, and this vault has the key vaults for the API team, the flight operations team. This was created with some other pipelines that we saw in the first workshop, and this is where the secret is being stored for this team. Right? And so this is how Konnect is looking like at this stage. And again, those are the control planes that belong to our flight operations team, which were created during the first workshop. So during the first workshop, this team was onboarded into the platform, and then the team requested these 3 control planes for each one of the environments that they want to work with. So those are provided. If we go to the control plane for the development environment, we will see that right now there is no configuration. There are no services configured, there are no routes configured, there are no plugins in here. There is already a data plane running, which is actually running in my laptop locally. But that data plane has no configuration because the control plane has no configuration, of course. So if I now go to Insomnia and I try to make a call to, for example, to the flights endpoint, because I want to know what flights are upcoming, I send a request, and then Kong is going to say, the data plane is going to tell me, hey, I don't have any configuration for this. I don't know how to route your request, which is the expected behavior right now. But then now as an API team, I go to GitHub. I'm here with in the actions panel of GitHub, and I'm going to invoke my workflow, publish API configuration. So I'm ready with my OpenAPI specification. I have specified what plugins I want to consume. So now it's time to run the workflow. I'm here specifying I want to publish this OpenAPI. I want to publish this OpenAPI specification into this control plane, and plugins are under this directory in my repository. So let's run the workflow. And in a few seconds, we will see the workflow running, and then we will follow the workflow step by step so that you can see how the different steps that we saw before are actually being executed. So this is now going. Let's take a look. This is a checkout, the initial checkout, and now the execution starts, right? So this is probably the first one that is interesting. We are seeing how the OpenAPI specification is run, and is run with the spectral configuration that we specified. And as you can see here, we see that there are no errors, but OWASP is throwing lots of warnings. Of course, OWASP is very strict in the security checking. So we'll see that the specification has a couple of warnings, but nothing is critical according to our configuration. So let me scroll a little bit more. So we passed the linting of the OpenAPI specification, and then we transformed the OpenAPI specification into Kong configuration. And this is the result of that transformation, right? So now OpenAPI is transformed into Kong configuration, and this is how a declarative Kong configuration looks like. So we are stating that the actual API is deployed under api.congair.com. And if someone invokes /flights or /flights with a flight number or /flights with a flight number and /details, then this should be routed to this service declaration here. This should be routed to the flight service, which is under api.congair.com. So this is what we are configuring here. That's okay. Now we added the plugins from the API team, right? So now you can see that this Kong configuration, it has now additional information. So for every route, if you remember, for every route, we want the plugin correlation ID. And now this is happening. So this is the configuration for the correlation ID for this route and for this other route and for this other route. So all this is good. Now we are checking, we are linting this Kong configuration to make sure that the API team is using only allowed plugins, which is successful. And now we add the plugins from the platform team. And now, as you can see, we have additional plugins. We have the OpenID Connect plugin configured here. We have the OpenAPI OAS validation plugin configured here. And we should see as well the rate limiting plugin somewhere. Oh, I think I missed that. It was previously at the service level probably, or was not configured finally. Anyway, we have OAS validation. We have this one. This is OpenID Connect, right? OAS validation. Rate limiting advances here, right? So this is the configuration for the rate limiting. Those are the 3 plugins that the platform team was configuring at this stage. So let's go to the next step. And the next step is now adding some patches, right? So that to tag all these entities with the API name and the configuration owner and the organization that owns this configuration. So let me scroll a little bit more. And now we obtain a backup of the current configuration, and now we know what is going to change, right, in the configuration. So given that the control plane is empty, so everything is going to be created. The service, the routes, and the plugins are going to be created. So Deck is telling us with the div, hey, if I'm going to create 12 entities now, and now we say, okay, go ahead, sync the configuration, and the configuration is now sent to the control plane, and the control plane will then push that configuration to the data plane. Let's take a look at that. Let's go to connect. And now if we go to services, now we see that the service is configured correctly. We see as well the routes that were in the OpenAPI specification and then in the Kong configuration, now synchronized to the control plane. And the plugins, we see the rate limiting plugin, OpenID Connect, correlation ID plugins in every route, and the OpenAPI specification validation plugin. So now everything is configured and it is synchronized. As we can see here, it's in sync with the data plane. Now, just for testing this, let me quickly disable the OpenID Connect just to avoid authentication in the service for the to make an initial call. And now I go to Insomnia, and I will now invoke the data plane with a /flights, and then the data plane has the configuration, so it's able to forward my request to the actual service implementation. So we can see here the reply. And just to make sure, if you remember, we configured the rate limiting plugin, so and it was like not more than 5 requests per minute. So let's try a couple more requests, a few more, and we will see that we get at some point in time a too many request, right? So here rate limiting is acting and saying, hey, you exceeded your number of requests right now. And so as you can see, from a developer standpoint, the only thing I had to do is to provide a simple workflow, which is this one. It's literally 63 lines of a workflow. Consume an action that has all the heavy lifting provided by platform engineering. And after that, execute the GitHub workflow, and I get my API fully configured in Kong in a matter of seconds. So I can go to Insomnia and just check another one like this one, give me the details of this, and here we go. So my API is now online, published, and routed via the Kong gateway. This is what we think a great developer experience looks like when configuring a gateway. And essentially, that's the demo that I wanted to share with you. I hope that was useful and illustrative. And I think now, Talia, we can open for any Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. That was super informative. And I think we have 3 questions now in the Q&A. If you want to go through them.
Yes. First question from Frank is, can we centralize all these APIs in one API for AI agents? Not sure if I'm getting completely the question, but the thing is, so when you are working with AI agents, so typically what you need is to, or typically what is provided is an MCP servers. So of course you can have an MCP wrapper around the APIs published by Kong. So stay tuned for future capabilities on our Kong AI gateway. But of course you can even expose all this functionality provided by LLMs. Probably you know that Kong provides an AI gateway, which specializes in managing API traffic for LLMs or in the AI space. And that is something that can be, of course, leveraged. So you can centralize all these APIs that are consuming LLMs via the Kong AI gateway. And in that way, the API teams will get, again, a very good developer experience, because then Kong AI gateway will offer a unified interface irrespective of the LLM that you want to invoke. You can centralize all that logic into the Kong AI gateway so that teams can consume LLM APIs, and then Kong will make sure that a lot of additional features regarding AI and LLMs are there, right? So I invite you to go to the developer side, and there, if you go for the AI gateway, you will see all the capabilities that we provide to mediate between API clients and large language models. Does gateway also act as a security API gateway? Well, yes. Again, if you go to the developer side and you go to the plugins section of the site, you will see that there is a range of security plugins. Security plugins, we saw already some, right? So we could argue that rate limiting is kind of a security plugin as well. OpenAPI specification is the fact that Kong validates that your request is in alignment with the OpenAPI specification. So we are already denying any request that is not in alignment to that. Then there is a range of authentication and authorization plugins. Probably the most popular one is the OpenID Connect, but there is a range of other ones for API keys, OAuth2, again, OpenID Connect, mutual TLS for security certificate-based authentication. So all these, there are plugins to validate the payload against the schema. So there is a range of plugins that you can leverage for security purposes. Luis asks, any suggestion on how to manage global plugins that we want to apply to all APIs? So if, well, that's actually the purpose of a global plugin. So you typically use a global plugin, and if that plugin is at the global scope in Kong, that means that that plugin applies to all the entities that you have configured in Kong. And this is typically something that this can be sensitive. So typically with customers, we advise that this is something that managed by the API platform team, this kind of plugins. And typical examples of those global plugins are observability plugins like logging, metrics, or tracing. So those are plugins that in general, or it's very common to configure them at a global level so that you make sure that every request that flows through the gateway is properly, can be observed properly, right? So I would suggest us to manage global plugins at the platform team level and then configure from there so that every API team can benefit from that. Can we get a link to the GitHub repo? Excellent question. Yes, you will get a link after the third workshop that Dalia shared with you in the chat. At the end of October, I think it's October the 28th. This will be the third and last workshop. And afterwards, we will share, so as a follow-up to that workshop, we will share a link to the GitHub repo. But we want to wait until we have all these capabilities built that we want to show you in those 3 workshops implemented in the GitHub repo. And then after the third one, we will share a link with all of you so that you can take it and you can make it your own and expand in your own organization. Is there a way we can integrate Kong with data power? Well, that's a very open question. If you mean data power, so data power, if I understand correctly, is another gateway offering. Integrate with data power. So I'm not sure in which way you mean integrating with data power. Of course, you can, for example, chain an API request through Kong and then data power, or vice versa, if that is what you mean by integration. But I would need to better understand the context and the use case of your question to properly address it. So I'm not sure if you can expand on that. And then what other tools should be installed apart from Deck? Right. So we offer, as I mentioned, so we offer Deck, of course. This is the command line tool that Kong offers that has all these, that has lots of capabilities to, let's say, create the configuration based on OpenAPI specification and then manipulate that configuration, split in different files, merge them afterwards to enable a federated way of working. So that is the capabilities provided by Deck. Then I think another kind of necessary tool is the Terraform provider that Kong provides, the official provider for Kong Konnect. This is a provider that you can use to manage the whole Kong state. So every entity that you see in Kong, control planes, teams, system accounts, as we saw in the first workshop, but then analytics reports. So every entity, you will be able to manage that via the Terraform provider, right? So I think that from the range of tools provided by Kong, I would suggest that in an APIOps pipeline, you rely on Deck and you rely on the Terraform provider. That could be my advice. How to install Kong using Podman in Windows machine? If you have steps, please share. So in the official documentation, which is developer.konghq.com, there is an installation section. And I can't remember now from the top of my head if there are steps for Windows. But if you have Podman installed in Windows, then you will go to, you can go and install a Kong data plane via Docker, right? And that's something that you can perfectly do in Windows. So when you are in Kong Konnect and you are in a control plane, there is, and you want to install a data plane that will connect to that control plane. So that is, then a wizard will start that will give you the Docker configuration that you just have to copy and paste in a Windows machine if you have Podman there, and then via Docker, it will start the data plane. INSO, if you would like to test from GHA CLI. Yes, true. That's a very good point. Thank you. That's another tool that you can install as well. So Insomnia is the desktop application that I shared during this demo that I was using to make those requests. But then you can export everything that you have configured in Insomnia. You can export that as a file, which is the, let's say, Insomnia as code, if you want. And then you can execute not only the request, but if you have specified tests, for instance, you can export all that in a declarative file, and then via inso, which is the command line tool that goes hand in hand with Insomnia, then you can run all those requests or contract testing in a pipeline, right? So that's a good point. That's another tool to keep in mind that you can leverage in such a pipeline. I don't see any other question in the Q&A.
I think we have one more in the chat.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
and there is one. There is
Oh,
now
yeah,
a new
one more
one
in the,
in the
yeah.
Q&A. You mentioned that the observability should be managed by platform team, but in cases where the API team wants to use their own observability for their APIs, let's say they even self-hosted data plane. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which is a perfectly fine way, right? So the scenario that I presented in this workshop is the one that derives from our imaginary Kong Air. And they made the decisions they made in the API community of practice. It's perfectly valid to make the decision that API teams will take care of the data planes and they will take care of managing them if they so wish, right? And therefore they will, and if they want their own observability stack, if that is the case in your organization, which is perfectly fine. But that means that some of the steps that we have seen that are now in the platform team will then become a responsibility of the API teams, or the platform team will share the templates so that the API teams will have a much easier life when configuring observability. But of course, I mean, in a federated setup, there is no black and white. So it's a range of gray. Some organizations, they want to leverage, so they want the platform team to do almost all the heavy lifting and then have API teams that work at the open API specification, and that's it. That's mostly what I have showcased today. Some other organizations follow this pattern for most of the teams, but there are some special teams that they want to manage their data planes and they want to have more flexibility on observability, for example. That's perfectly fine, right? And those are cases in which the API teams will take more responsibility. How is failover handled for the gateway itself? So failover, so you can, first of all, you can deploy, and we typically deploy several instances of the data plane, the gateway, so that there is high availability in that respect, so or horizontal availability. If your question is more on failover of the upstream APIs, then again, the gateway has entities like upstreams and targets, which entities which we have not seen in this workshop, but will allow you to specify how the gateway should be checking the health, let's say how health those upstreams APIs are, and avoiding them if they are not properly healthy, and then fail over to another instance if that is configured, right? So this is some techniques to handle the failover. Is there a cost calculator that provides projections and stats around costs? You mean the pricing of the product? I think there is, if you go to the Kong Konnect website and you want to use it straight away, so there is a pricing there, right? That's everything I know. If it's more like an enterprise engagement, then I think you'd better contact sales via our website and they will provide cost projections if necessary. Right, is there? So that was the question in the chat, right? Oh, there is another one. How can I check the rate limit counter from the backend in Kong metrics stat? For example, if a client is allowed 100 requests per minute, I'd like to see the corresponding rate limiting counter. Yeah, good question. I can't remember now if that is something reported via Prometheus metrics. Honestly, I would have to check the documentation if that is something that is reported by Kong. But I'm not 100% sure. Sorry, I'm not able to answer this with precision right now. If you can see that. Is there any other question, Dalia? Do you see? I don't see any other questions.
I think we're good. And then I posted the link to the community Slack. So if anyone wants to ask any follow-up questions, please join the Slack. And in a general one, you can post your questions and we'll get to them. But I think that was everything. Thank you so much, Georgie, for powering through those questions so quickly. Thanks everyone for being so participative and asking. Really appreciate it that you stayed with us till the end. And I look forward to seeing you on October 28th, the Developer Day. And with that, I think we can close today.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining.